Feminism and Intersectionality. And she's here tonight in conversation with Dianna Taylor. Heather is a lecturer of sociology and a feminist scholar at Case Western Reserve University, and a visiting researcher, maybe more than that, now at the Cleveland Clinic. For nearly 20 years, she's been participating and studying a variety of social movements in the United States and the Global South. Heather analyzes contemporary urban protests, social movements, health disparities, and patients' experiences using a feminist and intersectional lens. With the grant from Case Western Reserve's Friedman Center for Digital Scholarship, Heather developed a digital Occupy archive of the data that informs this book, the flyers, posters, newspapers, ephemera, which is freely available to the public online. There's a link to that too in our event, in this event on our website. And the book and the archive are not only scholarly achievements, but just an extraordinary resources for all of us. And Heather will be in conversation with Dianna Taylor. Dianna is a professor of philosophy and director of the Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies program at John Carroll University here in Cleveland. She's the author or editor of several books, and the latest one was published last year by Routledge. Her current research analyzes rage and counter-violence as feminist resources for resisting and preventing sexual violence. So thanks everyone for being here, and we're going to start the program now.
Okay, great. Thank you, Suzanne, for that introduction. And thanks to everybody for coming. So Heather, I'll just jump right into the first question, which is to ask you to give us a definition of intersectionality for participants here tonight who might not be familiar with that concept. And the origin of that concept is from 1989 from the legal scholar and critical race theorist Kimberly Crenshaw. She introduced that notion in order to illustrate the specific disadvantage that Black women endure, which is distinct from the racism that Black men experience and the sexism that white women experience. So could you just give us an overview of intersectionality as you understand it?
Absolutely, and I thank you for that question. This is one of the questions that I've been trying to talk about widely when I talk about the book, because I think it's a kind of key takeaway for me about the Occupy movement, that it was not approaching problems intersectionally, not thinking about inequalities as interrelated. So the idea of intersectionality, as Kimberly Crenshaw wrote about, and she was really building on the work of especially women of color feminists before her, who had often thought of problems that they endured as influenced by several dimensions of inequality really coming together to create a new kind of situation where it could not just be explained as enduring an economic inequality. It's inaccurate to just talk about class inequality. People who have different identities experience it differently. We have to think about the relative privilege or lack of privilege that someone might have because of their racial identity, or someone's privilege or lack of privilege because they're a man or a woman. And then in a particular class situation or a job, each individual would be really at a certain advantage or disadvantage. So it's the intersection of these different forms of inequality coming together. And where the Occupy movement didn't really get on board with this message was they so prioritized class as a kind of monist analysis or a primary analysis of class, that these other dimensions and these specifics about class inequality were kind of lost. And it was unfortunate. A lot of people didn't feel very included in the movement's messages. because it wasn't considering the whole of their identities.
Great, thank you. Yeah, and you know, of course, having read your book, you really elucidate that shortcoming of the Occupy movement. And I have a question, I'll circle back to that in a little bit to talk a little bit more about that. For now, I wanted to just get into and unpack the idea of intersectionality just a little bit more. And in her book, the title of which is So You Want to Talk About Race, writer Ioma Aluo posits reasons why, quoting her, social justice movements have been slow to adopt intersectional practices, which of course is what you show with Occupy. And she focuses on three broad reasons, which are that she says intersectionality slows things down. And it slows things down because people have to consider the needs and situations of more than just a select few. She says intersectionality brings people face to face with their privilege. And so people may be even more uncomfortable than usual to look critically at their own possible implication in oppressive structures and institutions, especially within movements that are themselves aiming to counter oppression within society. The question would be, how can I resist oppression if even inadvertently I'm reinforcing it? And then finally, she says intersectionality forces people to interact with, listen to, and consider people they don't usually interact with, listen to, or consider. And the question here, it's just a statement quoting her, she says, while many people would not consider this unpleasant, it is often uncomfortable, at least at first. And I brought her work into play here in this event because when I was reading your book, I kept thinking about these issues that she raises. Why social justice movements, where you think intersectionality would be a natural thing folk would adopt, they don't. So I was wondering if you could just sort of maybe give some specific instances where you saw any one or some of these hesitancies around intersectionality coming into play with the Occupy movement.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. It's just such an appropriate conversation to have these books together. So thank you so much for bringing Aluo's
I think
work.
it's Aluo. I think it's Aluo. Yeah.
Aluo's work
O-L-U-O.
in here.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, this is a real kind of puzzle that it's too bad that we are still puzzling over, because I think social movements have in some ways recognized this problem, or at least some people have, for decades, even since probably the 50s, maybe even before. And the point that first resonates with what I learned about the Occupy movement is about slowing down and also making things kind of more complex. But this was a move, and this might be a problem that is there for social movements in the future, and even for other organizations that are not social movements, because everything has been sped up with the internet, with social media. In some ways, it's a good thing. People were able to connect more quickly and the movement spread very rapidly. But there were a lot of demands on the movement to frame the movement, to make a statement, to get their message out, and to pause, to slow down, to stop when there were major complaints about sexual harassment within the encampments and the marginalization of women leaders as in part a byproduct. There wasn't someone who could kind of stop the flow of things to deal with those kinds of problems. And even there was a major debate within the movement, which I recognize and describe and analyze in the book, which is the push for changing the name of Occupy to decolonize, which I don't think that this got a lot of media attention at the time, but among Occupy participants, it was really a national debate in many cities that the idea Occupy was similar to occupation, colonization, that indigenous people have been fighting to not have their lands occupied for centuries, that this was not the best name. But to have that intersectional perspective of we want a movement's name and purpose and organizing to be inclusive of people of many different races and ethnicities and genders, I think it's not an excuse, but there was a lot going on that people in Occupy were dealing with. I think they should have dealt with it probably in another way. It's one of the recommendations I say in the book is, instead of shifting infighting to a committee or having another group deal with it, when you have major issues about not having an intersectional perspective, it's really time to stop and slow down and deal with those things. So I think Oelu is really right on in her analysis, and I definitely saw that in Occupy.
Thank you for that answer. And I wanted to say, you know, that was one of the things, one of many that really resonated with me when I was reading your book, because I had not heard about that move to change the name. I thought, wow, that makes a lot of sense, that would be deeply offensive, right? That notion of occupation. So yeah, and did that get traction at all? That it did in some cities, I believe you said, right? The move to
yes,
enact that change.
Mm-hmm. In Oakland and in Albuquerque were some of the kind of key places where this was happening. But there were groups around the country that started to modify the Occupy name to call themselves Unoccupy, or decolonize groups really began to spring up. And it's part of a kind of motion that was a part of the movement when volunteers, which everyone was, became dissatisfied with part of the movement. They created their own movement, their own groups. So those subgroups could really recognize particular issues and leaders. And like the decolonized group that I hung out with in Oakland was, they did a reading group about Gloria Anzaldua's Borderlands. I mean, they were on the intersectional feminist pathway, and they put that into action, and they weren't going to wait for kind of the movement overall to kind of catch up with them. They kept going, and they did their own actions, and that was possible in the movement. To kind of have these autonomous spin-off kind of groups. It's part of the vibrancy of the movement. I think that it's part of why eventually the movement kind of dwindled and lost some of its vibrancy, though. So I think it's a real moment of caution for us, for any organization, but especially social movements, when we kind of start to see that kind of splintering. And, I think there was a really good idea in the decolonize movement, bringing it more fully into, how do we reframe the collective identity? Maybe this is something to go with. I think it could have been helpful. And then, of course, about a year later, emerged Black Lives Matter, And so I think, I know that a lot of the people who are participating in things like Decolonize and other racial justice movements that have been long going, really saw the mass mobilization of Black Lives Matter as doing what Occupy wasn't.
Thanks. Again, I'm going to ask you to get into a little bit more detail about some of that in just a moment. I wanted to ask you to speak a little bit, because you've already made this point, and you started off by saying that the lack of intersectionality had weakened the Occupy movement. And I wanted to ask if you could speak specifically about what you describe as discriminatory resistance, what that is and how it emerged and what the effects were.
So throughout the book, I'll just start by saying there were so many things that I appreciated about Occupy. I mean, I'd see myself as wearing 3 hats, really. I was a participant in the movement, and there were a lot of things about the movement that I feel were important. We're left with, I mean, just about everyone knows about the 1% versus the 99% now. Economic inequalities on the radar for people to talk about, and Occupy in many ways brought that into being, kind of kicked off this era of protest. And I also wore a hat as a researcher, kind of standing back, being critical, and a third hat as a feminist. So really kind of tuned in to women and queer persons' experiences and bringing a feminist lens and scholarship to try to understand what was going on. So I just preface that by saying that because I think that I could not have understood discriminatory resistance in just any situation. Occupy was a movement where there were so many participants, leaders, and people who were rotating in and out of leadership positions, people who are really committed participants, who were active and really engaged. And I think that was part of how I could understand the leadership dynamics really in motion. And so as I was observing who was taking on leadership roles, who was taking responsibility, who was speaking the most, I started to pick up on that there were moments when people who we might not traditionally see as leaders, typically, I mean, if you look around us, the majority of leaders who are quoted in the newspaper or who sit in the halls of Congress or who are CEOs, they are white men. This is something that we've learned, and I argue we really need to kind of unlearn that, because we've defaulted into providing legitimacy to white men who lead. And when I noticed that when someone who was not white or not a man or not maybe presenting as straight or cis or you name it, just someone who maybe is not this kind of default idea of who we have that should lead, when they tried to lead a meeting or put forward an idea or even tried to speak up during a mic check, I found that followers around them and people listening to them somehow discriminated against them in some way, maybe interrupted them as they were speaking, or failed to vote for their suggestion. But if a white man would say the same thing afterwards, everyone was for it. So this idea of discriminatory resistance is when followers, who I think actually have a lot of power, and I think Occupy demonstrated that, participants have a lot of power and input, but when those followers fall back on the kind of stereotypes and prejudices. They can discriminate against potential leaders and undermine their leadership. And this was the process that I saw happening. You know, I think a lot of people didn't want it to happen, but I think it's really ingrained. And I think we need new models for who are new leaders. We need a vision for that. So that's where the term comes from.
Thank you. And you had said, the examples that you gave, you said you observed people not, speaking over non-traditional leadership figures and maybe not voting for their platforms, but you also described in the book overt harassment, right? And that, so it became even more extreme than that in some cases. And so I want to shift into this other question, and then if we have time, I want to go back to, because as I mentioned to you, there are two questions I really wanted to get to. And if we have time, I want to circle back to, because a lot of what you talk about in this book, and as I said at one point, I was really glad that you mentioned the parallels between the sort of feminist groups splitting away from the larger Occupy group, because that's exactly what happened in the New Left, right, during the 1960s and 70s. So the feminist movement women broke away because of the sexism that they experienced. And I thought, how many times do we have to go through this, right? So I wanted to follow up because I did have a question about the issue of followers. And one of the things I really appreciated, I really liked, I thought was interesting, is that you say followers aren't passive, right? Followers have agency, and they actually have a lot of power. And so one of the questions I had for you was, how is refusing to merely follow, right? Just to simply go along? How is that a strategy to resist traditional views about models of leadership, right? If we just, how is refusal a strategy there? And I said, can the organizing among feminists and genderqueer activists in Occupy be seen as that kind of refusal, do you think?
Well, I love that. I feel like we should write a paper about that together. And maybe there's a historical angle there of really bringing out, as you say, this maybe captures some of what was happening in the New Left and now happening again. And I do think that there was absolutely a refusal to go along with a movement that was not, that was kind of erasing feminism and to find other outlets for feminist organizing. And at the same time, though, these feminists, I'm kind of amazed with them because they offered a lot of support to the Occupy movement. And in part, this was because activists from the 60s and 70s were there again in Occupy, which is, it's just incredible about this moment in social movements where we have so many generations of activists coming together. And I think there was some recognition, this is happening again. Well, we're not going to go along with that. We know that when, for example, women get together, unique, powerful things happen, and we're not going to let this movement kind of take that away.
Yeah, so I think I do then, I think I do want to then go to this one question that I had, which is, there's a history on the left, right, of this, as you emphasized at the beginning of your comments this evening, to focus on economic oppression, right? And I've always, the way I put it is, this view that if you take care of, and so feminists, people of color, genderqueer folk are always being told, oh, just wait, like wait your turn, because we have to deal with this first. This is the real issue. And if we deal with this, then I said it's a sort of, it will act as a rising tide that will lift all of our boats magically, right? Even though, as you've pointed out, not everybody is starting from the same place. So even if all boats are lifted, some are still going to be lower than others, right?
Mhm.
And so you've talked about how that attitude was reflected in the Occupy movement. Part of what I wanted to ask was, given this history, I said, if groups that are marginalized within social justice movements have to separate in order to address their oppression, can progressive movements gain the sort of traction that is needed to affect widespread social change? And part of what I wonder about here is whether we necessarily need mass movements to challenge oppressive power and bring about social transformation, or can smaller, more focused movements do the trick, perhaps if they work in consort with one another? I don't know. I mean, but I'm just responding to this sort of perpetual problem in progressive politics. So I just wondered what you thought about that.
Definitely. I agree with you. I see the problem similarly as you. I think mass movements are very special. I think that there was so much excitement about Occupy because we hadn't seen such mass activism in more than 1,000 town squares around the country, spread around the globe. People coming together in this participatory democracy movement for so many issues. It just hadn't been seen in maybe decades. I mean, maybe the anti-war movement in the early 2000s was something like that, but I don't think it was on the scale that Occupy was. I think there's something special about mass movements. I think that I would love to see another one that could center intersectionality. I think in some ways the Black Lives Matter movement is doing that. I think that it is a mass movement. I don't know how widespread the kind of full agenda and mission of Black Lives Matter is to the general person. But if you look into their platform and the Movement for Black Lives kind of organizing strategy, it's really taking into account a range of different issues, even beyond police brutality. And I think the movement has worked to center intersectionality. There are some issues. I've written a short piece about, there's still tensions about LGBTQ issues within the Black Lives Matter movement and acceptance of trans persons to some degree, and even, Say Her Name, the movement to recognize women's experiences of police brutalities, often marginalized to those experiences of men. But I think they're doing a lot of things right. And I do think it's needed because movements like the LGBTQ movement has been incredible over this last decade, with the presence of trans rights activists and understanding about transgender issues, the amazing move to legalize same-sex marriage, which was actually happening at the same time as Occupy, but there was a disconnect between the movements, which is kind of an unfortunate thing. I always think, if there was a mass movement that could bring together those kinds of moments, really have these deep coalitions and a real respect and understanding started by that, having this intersectional view that we have to address inequalities simultaneously across them, and not that, I think there was a view that the message has to be just the 99% economics. That's the way to get people in. I don't think it's going to fly in the future. You know, I have hope with the next generation, with some of the students who are here tonight who have grown up with intersectionality now. And it's really a part of millennials and the generation after millennials. It's how I think they're really starting to kind of see things and see the world around them. So I have hope for that. And I have hope another mass movement could come around with that view. Do you see this in your students as well, Dianna?
I absolutely do. Yeah, very much so. The things that, you know, my generation is getting on, you know, going, yeah, we need to think about these things. It's their, for us, it's what we're sort of moving toward. And for them, it's their point of departure. You know, it's where they're at.
I love that.
Yeah, I learned from them a lot in my teaching.
I do too.
So I these two last questions. One is about solidarity, and you talk about solidarity in the book. And one of the things that I said was, and I'll make this brief, winnow it down, but the way that I you know, in my work in thinking about coming into solidarity with victim survivors of sexual violence. And part of what it seemed to me was that can be difficult because I think there's a tendency from non-victim survivors to feel like, well, I can't really understand where this person's coming from and they've been through this traumatic experience. So I sort of withdraw because they feel like if I'm not on the same page, I can't really relate. I might say something wrong, you know, these kinds of things. And so what I've argued is that solidarity needs to entail a foregrounding of difference and the incommensurability of experience that stems from difference, right? So if we put that out there, and again, I'm going to use my same language, if we use that as our point of departure, then it's not a barrier anymore. One of the things that it does make us have to get used to, though, as I said, is being okay with the fact that nobody's ever going to totally get it and that we're going to fail. And we have to be willing to return to the site of our failure and use it as a productive moment rather, again, than to say, well, oh, I screwed up, I've got to withdraw. And I thought that this perspective on solidarity was consistent with the intersectional perspective on political activism that you were talking about in the book. And so I just wondered what you thought about that.
Well, I love how you put it, and that is a mission for us all. So thank you for doing that work. I think I agree that I love how you put it, kind of being appreciative of difference and not being able to get the whole story, but maybe know that you should have appreciation for that whole story. I saw that in Occupy. I saw that in the group in Denver who created this fishbowl caucus where they had activists in the center telling their stories, and then activists, and especially women and queer people and femmes in the center, kind of really explaining the depth of their experiences of, you know, being faced with people not getting their consent or feeling harassed or just feeling unseen as gender queer persons, and the group outside listening, and like what a consciousness raising session that was within the movement. And I think that's a time when they were able to build some of that solidarity based on difference.
Yeah.
That you're talking about. I wish I would have thought about that a little more even when writing the book, because it sounds, now that you've raised it, I'm sure I could, that could be the way to really describe things in this
So
book.
I really want to, and I'm going to get to my last question, but I just want to follow up with you on that, because part of what I also asked in this question was, so I think that kind of solidarity is possible among, say, the feminist breakaway groups that you talk about. But how do we get, the sort of white cis men who want to sort of be in charge? How do we get those folk to see that, as you argue, and there's like Aluo and Crenshaw show, intersectionality is in everyone's best interest, because as you show, the lack of that is what weakened Occupy. So how can we get the traditional folk who want to be in charge and push their agenda to see that they're, that the transformative social change that we all want is undermined by their unwillingness to engage in this kind of solidarity? Do you have, that's something I wrestle with all the time, and that's a tough question, but I just wondered if you had any thoughts about that.
One thought is feminist men leading the way, because there were a few that I spoke with who were just, they got it, and they had this different vision of Occupy, and they saw some of these tensions happening and weren't happy and worked to oppose them. And one of the innovations in Occupy was this idea of step up, step back. And I think that we could have trainings about step up and step back, where there's some education about intersectionality, about who's usually heard and who's usually not. And we put it on individuals to, if you're someone who's usually heard and you're pretty loud and you're pretty respected, it's time to listen. It's time to step back. And, I don't know if this piece is harder or it's just as hard. People who are usually quiet, to feel comfortable, respected, supported, that they step up and can speak. And it's tough both ways. I mean, I think it takes a lot of work, but those are two things that come to mind to maybe build on some rays of hope from Occupy.
Okay, so thank you. And I'm going to move to my last question. So we have time. So we have time for questions. And it sort of, we've talked about how in our students' potential, but of course, our students are going to be facing a completely different reality, right? Because of the pandemic. I mean, I think our sort of desire is to quote unquote get back to normal. And I don't think the world is going to be the same after this, right? And that's something that we have to grapple with, how it's changed. One of the things that we see really clearly is that this pandemic has brought to public view vast inequalities and oppression that exist in the United States and throughout the world, right? And the marginalized groups that we've been talking about have disproportionately suffered during the pandemic. And I've read things, studies that show that women, people of color, gender queer people have, the gains that they've made have in some senses been rolled back by this pandemic, right? Like women having to drop out of the workforce, and a whole host of things we could talk about, but if we had time. But in thinking about this, there was a New York Times article recently, the title of which is "The Lockdown Showed How the Economy Exploits Women She Already Knew." And it focuses on the work of a feminist philosopher. Her name is Silvia Federici. She's 78 years old, right? And you're smiling because the Occupy movement sort of, people sort of rediscovered Federici's work. She had been talking about these things for a really long time. Yeah. And in her argument, this is a quote from her: "Feminist struggle is necessarily anti-capitalist struggle." And again, quoting her, she says, "Capitalism as a socioeconomic system is necessarily committed to racism and sexism. For capitalism must justify and mystify the contradictions built into its social relations by denigrating the quote unquote nature of those it exploits: women, colonial subjects, the descendants of African slaves, the immigrants just displaced by globalization. And so my question is, do you think the inequality and oppression the pandemic has exposed will encourage, or perhaps is already encouraging, social critique and activism similar to the Occupy movement? Or do you worry that the rolling back, the sort of disempowerment of marginalized groups is going to hinder the activism that we need? So I just wondered if you had any thoughts about where we stand at this. And it's always hard to stand within the moment that you're trying to analyze, right? You kind of have to have a backward look on that. So I know it's a tough question, but I just wondered what you thought. Have you had a gut feeling at this point?
It's a really tough question. It's actually one I'm kind of curious what others here might have to say if they'd like to. You know, as a sociologist, I know that change is possible because that's what we do. We study how people change over time, how organizations change, what people do when their attitudes change. So I know that that's possible. And that's, I guess, the root of kind of my hopefulness about change being possible. I think that the pandemic laying bare, and I will say also some of the martyrs of police brutality and of the pandemic, fortunately and unfortunately, I think has been a wake up for people who even are not activists, that they need to be doing something more. I'm seeing that in non-activist spaces that I'm involved with in the community, that the conversation has shifted. It's shifted into a conversation, I think, more about anti-racism and wanting to create anti-racist organizations. I think there's still a long way to go between talking and doing. I love the work of Ibrahim X. Kendi's work on anti-racism. And so I think there is really a motion for change. I think there's a lot of backlash for change happening too. A lot of backlash, a lot of people feeling that these movements for justice, for you name it, you know, women who are harassed at the workplace, to, we could go on, are misplaced, because I think a lot of people are suffering.
Yeah.
People have suffered because of globalization and because of capitalism. I love Sylvia Federici's work.
I do too. Yeah.
Caliban and the Witch was the best book I read in grad school. I just love that book and her work. You know, we've learned a lot, and a lot of people have learned over the last 10 years. It's been an incredible decade of social movement activism, kind of sparked by the Arab Spring and Occupy and activists in Greece and more. And it's just continued in so many ways. So I have hope that that activism maybe becomes a little bit more just kind of a part of our daily lives, maybe. Not that we get burned out, but maybe people will really kind of not take for granted the illusions of capitalism anymore that Federici talks about. It's really kind of been laid bare, and we might just have the tools that we can push towards some kind of change.
Great. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Great.
Thank
That's
you.
a fair answer. So I'll stop with my questions now, so we have time for you to get some questions from folks who are here.
Great.
Hi, everyone. That was a great chat. I'm Rosa. I put a couple links in the chat for Heather's book and for Caliban and the Witch that was mentioned. If anyone has any questions, I see someone has already asked one, just type them into the chat and then I will ask them. So we have our first question from Lee. Regarding the socio-cultural indoctrination to perceive white males as legitimate leaders, do you think there is a primary source of this perception? In other words, is there a priority area in which this could be targeted? For example, female teachers working under purview of male principals or overrepresentation of white males in history books.
My answer is D, all of the above. We are combating hundreds of years of white men making a lot of the decisions. And I love some of the efforts to kind of chip away at that, from the op-ed project that gets people who are typically not white cis men, straight men, to get their ideas out there, to see the power in their words, and to become part of newspapers, where right now the majority of journalists and the majority of people who are interviewed by those journalists are white men. But you know, it's a hard question because there are just so many areas where we need different leaders. I'll also just amplify the work of the Athena Film Festival, a festival that I got the chance to be a part of at Barnard College in New York City, where they spend the weekend showing films of mostly women leading in ways that are unique and different, and they validate, and you leave the festival with a new vision of who is a leader, and what new and different vision of leadership could look like. I guess I would just finish answering that question by saying, if it's on your radar that something is kind of tugging at you, that, you know, this is the status quo and this isn't accurate, you know, there are these, this is not a representation of the leaders who I know in my life and I respect, the you know, the women who are so much a part of, who so much were a part of the civil rights movement, that we need to amplify their experiences. You know, Belinda Robnett's book, How Long, about women of the civil rights movement, or a new book that just came out, which I'm super excited about. I think it's called The Three Mothers, about the mothers of MLK and Malcolm X and James Baldwin. And so we need to do whatever we can to recognize women leaders. I think media and politics are good places to start, but it can be in a lot of different places.
This is kind of a related question that's hard. That might be a big, hard question, but it was privately texted to me. And so you've talked about this a little bit, but what kind of, like, do you think of a specific type of leadership structure that would maybe best facilitate or incorporate intersectionality? Like, do you think that exists? Like, is it anarchy, or, I mean, what do you think?
I am for more structure rather than less structure. I, from studying the Occupy movement, would advocate structured leadership trainings that are regularly available to many people, and also training about what is leadership and these ways that we can fall back on only respecting certain kinds of leaders. I think potentially, voting or regulating people to, if you're part of this organization, you've got to take the lead for this part. We want diverse leadership. And so you're not just committing to be a follower here, you're a very engaged follower. I see nothing wrong with followers, but we need you to take these responsibilities too. I think where the movement went wrong was there was a lot of volunteering, and there were times when a couple of guys would get together and say, you know what, we know how to take care of this. We don't need anyone else's opinions. And the kind of deciding things by consensus sort of fell away because it was a little bit too loose.
I just wanted to follow up with that. And that was one of the questions that I had that I let go because I didn't want to take up too much time. But that absolutely, I agree with you, Heather, that when movements, because that was in the New Left, right? Oh, leaderless movement, we're going to not be hierarchical and do all of these things. But then in the structures, the usual suspects are the ones who rise to the surface, and we can pretty consistently see that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, if anyone else has any other questions, please post them in the chat. Otherwise, Heather, I was just wondering if you might talk a little about the Occupy archive at CWRU.
Definitely, I'd love to mention that. So it was a dream of mine that all of my wanderings to different Occupy encampments and all of the incredible media that the movement created would somehow land somewhere to be available. And I met some incredible librarians at Case Western, and we kind of put our heads together, and they had the know-how and the tools to scan, to take photographs, to otherwise digitize about 400 objects that I had collected, and also organize it, tag it, create this whole search engine. And we collaborated, and with some student researchers who were really, they were just so gung-ho about it and committed. We spent Friday mornings together from like 8 a.m. We were there scanning because we wanted this this archive to be available. And it's a resource for students, teachers, for other activists to be able to kind of stand back and look at these objects themselves and be able to see a lot of what I describe in the book. And it would be, it's great. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. We have a lot of these tools there. And I think, I hope that activists and more will use that. So I can share, maybe if you have the link, share it, and it's free and open for people to use. There's also, the students themselves came up with a lecture. So that's there for teachers to use, a PowerPoint presentation. It's kind of ready to go to slot it into different classes. And other librarians helped me create some assignments with it too. So it's a really good resource. Thanks for asking about it. It was a dream come true.
Awesome. Okay, well, I don't know if either of you have any final thoughts. This was a fantastic conversation. Thank you so much for joining us. Thanks to everyone who came. Any final thoughts that you didn't get to talk about or anything?
Not on my end. We covered everything.
Okay, awesome.
Thank
I
you.
think the link, oh no, I think I sent the link directly to one person. So I'm gonna put the chat, right before we exit, I'm gonna put the archive link right in the chat. And then if you scroll up to the top of the chat, you'll find the first link is to Heather's book.
And there's also a website for the book. It's www.arewethe99book.com, and everything's there too.
Cool.
Awesome. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone for coming.
Yeah.
Great to be here with you. Thank you, Diana.
Thank you, Heather. Bye.
Bye, everyone.